And this is part 3 of assembling the Prusa MK3s Plus. And we're going to be starting with the E-axis for this portion of the video. And we'll get all the parts out that we need. Get all of our 3D printed plastic bits. Take a look at the instructions and see what it says. So we're going to start with this extruder bag and this piece here. Put our hardware into a bin. A little bit of organization goes a long way with this since there's a lot of parts. So you can see that we have a couple magnets there and a very small magnetic ball, little ball bearing. It's not very magnetic though. So we'll just get all of our bolts and nuts prepared in our plastic part, tighten them in properly so that they're ready to receive the bolt ends. And we'll get one of our magnetic bars here, and we're going to slide it into this lever part, and this lever part's going to fit into the larger plastic casing here. The other magnet will slide into a slot that's on the side, and they're going to repel each other, so there's a slight bit of springiness. So you can see here, when we put the magnet up close, it draws the other side in, and when we flip it, it kind of pushes it apart. So I've oriented the magnets so that they repel each other there. Now we have our small ball bearing, and it's going to go inside the small block, and the small block's going to slide into place in that plastic piece. Now we'll move on to the motors and getting the mounting brackets on the motors. And as usual, let's get our hardware sorted so that it's easy for this specific part of the project. We'll get our hardware and all the plastic bits and a couple of tooth gears. You can see here we want the one with the hole, not the one without the hole. So this one here has no hole, no grub screw, and the other one has a grub screw. And we'll go ahead and get this bracket tightened up onto the motor. And we'll do it super speed. Okay, so this is how it should look. And then we'll go ahead and we will attach this small tooth gear onto the axle of the motor, and we'll tighten it on there just a little bit so it doesn't fall off. And you can see that the groove in that gear there is lined up with the plastic part. So the next step lets us know that we need some filament to test out the alignment of that groove and the part of the plastic where the filament will run through. So let's grab our piece of filament. We'll just chop off a little bit at the end there, and we will try and put it through the groove in the plastic and line that up with the groove in the toothed gear that we attached to the axle. So running the filament through the groove was a little finicky, so I just used an Allen key here it's a little stiffer and a little easier to get them to line up with a solid object. So the next step is going to be getting the extruder hot end into the extruder body and assembling that portion of it. So we'll prep our 3D printed parts with the hardware that we need to assemble that. I'm just using the table here to help press these small square nuts into the 3D printed part, and then I'll use the Allen key to get it all the way in. We'll grab our hot end. You can see here, this is the standard hot end that comes with the Prusa, and we'll collect our hardware to mount that into the plastic. So I put these bolts in beforehand because they are kind of covered by the heatsink on the hot end. So it just makes it easier to fit them in if you put them in before you put the hot end in. Then we'll get our hot end motor and we'll place it on top there. I'm using the box, just like the instructions say. Have something that you can hang the heater core over with the wires so that it doesn't bend or break. And then we'll go ahead and we'll screw the 3D printed parts together with the bolts that were provided. So now that this is complete, we'll move on to the next step, which is how we're going to get that heavy motor attached to the rails on the Prusa, which is with the carriage body here. So this is the back panel that's going to kind of squeeze the front of the motor with the back panel that's there, that 3D printed part, and the bearings and rails will kind of be pinched in between there. So here I'm just kind of feeding the screw or the bolt through here to make sure that it's easy to go in and out. I found that these particular holes were a little bit more tight and difficult to get the bolts through. And then I will put the nut hardware into the piece and then we'll get it set up. So this portion is just mostly routing the wires, making sure that they're in the grooves that they need to be in so that they're not pinched or damaged when we're assembling it, and that they're properly routed so that they're in place when we need to plug them into the hot end and the fans and the extruder motor and all that kind of stuff. They all need to be tucked away nicely and neatly so that they're not pinched or damaged. So we'll be careful here, make sure that we do what we can to make sure that they're not damaged while we're assembling it. So getting these two together without pinching the wires was a little bit finicky, but it was possible. We kind of want these wires to go around each other and route properly. So just kind of get them together slowly and be careful. You don't want one wire to be into the heater core or near the radiator of the hot end. You don't want it to melt or anything like that. You want it all to be routed properly, not pinched. So it's slightly finicky here trying to get these into this channel here and then around a couple corners. But if you take your time, take a minute to do it, you'll be able to get it done. So now that we're tightening up the hot end into the 3D printed parts, this one specifically you kind of need the Allen key with the ball end on it, because it's at such an angle that it's difficult to do without the ball end Allen key. So make sure you have that on hand. It's much easier with that specific Allen key that they provide. And gummy bears. Not the ones that came with it, but they're still gummy bears. Okay, so this is the IR sensor. This is going to detect whether there's filament inside the hot end extruder or not. So we'll get that plugged in and in place. It just goes on top of the extruder here. It's a little bit finicky to get into the right place. It does seat into the spot quite well. You might notice I missed putting a screw in here, but I do catch that later on. So we'll get the sensor plugged in and we'll leave the wire with a little bit of slack for movement so that we can adjust the length and routing of the cable later on. So right here it's a little bit tight, so I grab the Allen key, I kind of fish a little bit of the wire out of the channel and it works perfectly fine that way. So just like that. And we have a small loop in that wire so that it doesn't get pinched and it has a little slack for a little bit of movement. So we'll get our bolts in and get everything buttoned down for this part. And then we can move on to the fan. There's a few versions here, so pay attention. I didn't pay attention, and a couple times I used the wrong screws. I ended up figuring it out with the right screws, but do pay attention to which version of which fan you have and the version of screws that you have for which pack. It might be a little bit confusing because there are extra screws in the previous Ziploc bag that was opened. There are labeled packs of screws for the individual sets of fans. So these bolts here are leftover bolts from the previous part of the assembly. They're not the correct set of bolts. So you'll struggle with getting them screwed in. They seem like they would reach and fit, but they just don't quite make it. So I end up finding a couple packs of screws, hot end version A and hot end version B sets. So I end up opening and using the correct hot end version pack, and they work perfectly fine. And then we can move on to the extruder idler. So this is the kind of the spring part that catches the filament inside the extruder and keeps it from slipping and pulling out. It's got some spring tension on like a little door so that you can see inside where your filament is. And you'll want to pay attention here because this little nut is in an open hole, so it can fall out. Mine was fairly tight fitting, but yours might not be. And then just make sure that your tooth gear goes on the right direction with the teeth on one side and the groove on the other. And then we're going to do another filament alignment. So you want the filament to go into the extruder and line up with your groove on the tooth gear so that it fits perfectly into that little groove. So you may need to loosen the grub screw on that gear that we assembled earlier and move it back and forth a little bit just so that it lines up perfectly with the filament going inside. And then this long screw makes like a kind of a door here. And then there's a screw on the table there in the background with a spring on it. And as you tighten that, it kind of pulls that door shut with spring tension. So you can see here that I didn't put the screw on the sensor, but I am putting the cover over top of it. And my thinking was that the cover held down that sensor in the right place. But you'll see a little bit later on, I will end up taking that off to replace the screw because I've noticed that I missed it. So our long screw, the spring goes through the back here to the other side where the door that we have with the small nut on it protrudes through. And you can just tighten that up until there's some spring tension, and this is what's going to pinch your filament to draw it through with the motor, through the extruder. And this is the cooling fan for the hot end to cool off the filament once it comes out of the extruder. You want it to be cooled very quickly usually. So this kind of directs the airflow from the other fan that we're going to put on later directly over the nozzle of the extruder. It's a weird shape, but it kind of slides in on an angle into the extruder body there. And then we use this longer screw to secure it in place. And then we'll get our ducted fan and we'll attach it to the fan mount that we just attached. Okay, and we'll see here, this is where I found out that the screw for the sensor was missing. So we're going to take this cover off, put the proper screw in, and put the cover back on. So let's get that done. Okay, now that the sensor is all sorted out, we can get back to the print fan. We'll get that lined up and tightened onto the chassis of the extruder body. And once the fan's all tightened up and on there, we will follow the manual and route the wiring for that fan across the side, past the extruder heatsink, and make sure that it goes through the proper grooves and ties into all the other wires that are coming out the other side, so that when we route these back into the control panel of the printer, they are all kind of in one spot. Then we will attach our Super Pinda sensor. This tells the extruder and the printer how far away from the bed the print head is. So it's a pretty important piece to this printer, and actually one of the things that makes it really great. It does auto leveling and self leveling, and 16-point matrix and all that kind of cool stuff, so that the bed is automatically leveled and the printer knows exactly where the bed is before the print starts. Pretty cool piece of tech. So we'll get that attached, we'll get it tightened up a little bit. We will need to adjust its height later on, so you see me, I come back and I loosen it a little bit because the manual says don't over tighten it yet. And then here we're going to pass the zip ties through small channels that are kind of self-directing. You put the zip tie in one end and it magically appears at the other end. Pretty cool part of 3D printing that made this channel available for us to use like this. So these zip ties are what will help us get the extruder assembly onto the crossbars here with the bearings that we attached earlier. We'll zip tie it so that it stays on there nice and tightly, and then we'll come back and attach the back side of the assembly to kind of hold it onto those bars. So here, if you're not really great with one hand and kind of maneuvering a zip tie closed, this might be a two-person job for you. I was able to hold the extruder assembly on with one hand, as you can see, and kind of just get one of the zip ties attached, not snugged up yet. And the second one I was able to do a little bit better by holding my thumb there and kind of using the stiffness of the zip tie to get it in, and then I pulled it tight so that I could let go of the actual assembly and then tighten up the other two. And we'll make sure they're nice and tight, and then we'll snip the long ends on them so we don't have to worry about them sticking out. So before we put the back panel on here, for the extruder assembly to hold it onto the rails, we're going to do some cable management, make sure everything is nice, lined up, and not tangled or twisted around each other. We want it to look nice so that when the extruder is moving around, it has lots of space to move around and not get kinked or caught up. And that's going to be the end of part 3. I'll see you in part 4. Bye!